Right, welcome back. Today we are talking shearing sheep, but we're talking not about shearing them in the summer when it's warmest, taking those woolly jackets off. We're actually talking about shearing them in the middle of the winter. And if you think that sounds counterintuitive, it is. Why would you take off a woolly jacket when the weather is coldest and wettest? Funnily enough, it's something that's reasonably common here in New Zealand, but also you do see it in places like the UK, Ireland, the USA, and there's a couple of different reasons why we do it, and those reasons vary depending on the system we're running. It's also not without its own risks and downsides, so it's something that needs to be planned really carefully if you're going to try and take advantage of the benefits. Just to clarify what I mean by a midwinter shear, I'm talking about essentially a mid-pregnancy shearing for ewes. So that is going to be about 50 to 100 days into their gestation, or about 14 to 17 weeks pre-lambing. So let's start with the upside. What are the benefits? Now, in an outdoor system, there is a modest reduction in lamb mortality when ewes are shorn compared to lambs born from unshorn ewes. Now that's something like 3%. Modest, still significant. Now the mechanism for this seems to be related to the fact that these lambs have an increased birth weight, therefore they're bigger, they're more resilient, and they have better body reserves when they're born outdoors. Exactly how that happens, we're not entirely sure. It may have something to do with the fact that the ewes are eating more to keep warm, but that doesn't seem to fully explain it in many cases. And that increase in birth weight is more significant in multiples, so twins and triplets, than it is in singletons. As well as the lamb birth weight effect, there's also this idea that if the ewe is shorn and the weather is poor, she is more likely to try and find somewhere to lamb when the time comes that is sheltered for her own comfort, and that's going to have the knock-on benefit that those lambs are going to be born somewhere a bit less cold and a bit less windy. Now, as for indoor systems, you do still see the same birth weight effect, and in Irish data, it doesn't appear that this birth weight is associated with any additional lambing difficulties, which is obviously would be at the back of our mind. Big lambs, we don't want big lambs to cause birthing issues. Specifically, that Irish data showed an increase of about 600 grams in birth weight. Now, perhaps more excitingly, it also seemed to be associated with a reduction in age to slaughter by about 2 weeks. Now, if you multiply that across, say, 1,000 lambs, that is a lot less pressure you're putting on your grass over the summer. It means lambs getting away earlier, it means more grass available for ewes in the run up to tupping, that golden period where we want to make sure they're being fed properly. It means hopefully less being spent on creep feed and so on. Setting the lambs aside for a second, shearing ewes pre-lambing normally means you can fit about 15% more of them in a given area, which could be quite handy if you're a bit tight on housing space, although everything else needs to be able to match that greater number of ewes. So provision of water, feed space, and so on. As well as that, in an indoor situation where ewes are likely to get a bit more dirty, shearing them pre-lambing is like to keep them cleaner pre and post-lambing, which is going to be probably nicer for them, nicer for us to look at, but critically it's going to make them cleaner for when the lambs are searching for that teat in the very first instance. It's going to reduce them getting infections. And benefits for both systems is that the lamb hopefully should be able to find that teat more easily, even if it's just the belly that's being crutched. Sheep are less likely to get cast on their backs if they're being shorn. And now this one's less exciting than it would have been in the past. Improved fleece weight and increased wool quality. I appreciate with the strong wool price where it is, it's not really at the forefront of everyone's mind. Now, onto the downsides, and it comes back to that counterintuitive nature of what we're trying to put across, right? Shearing sheep in the middle of winter seems to be a silly thing to do. And yes, there is a risk of cold stress, especially if we don't manage these ewes properly. So first of all, especially if they're outdoors, these ewes are going to require more feed, about 10 to 30% more feed in that first couple of weeks post shearing. And bearing in mind how critical winter feed levels are, that could be a real pinch point if you're shearing a large number of ewes. It's also going to require a lot of planning. You're going to have sheltered paddocks to keep these ewes in if a cold snap runs in. And if there's a big cold snap forecast, you're probably going to want to reorganize that shearing around that bad weather. And that increase in lamb birth weight and therefore lamb vigor we were talking about earlier is only going to really be seen in ewes that are in decent condition already. So by decent, I mean a condition 3 out of 5 or above. Shearing skinny sheep is unlikely to do them or their lambs many favours. And then of course we come on to the logistics of it. Trying to find a date that works for you and shearing contractors, where sheep are going to be gathered and they're going to be dry in the middle of winter, could be a real hassle. It's another thing to do. I hate to say it, it is another cost. Shearers work incredibly hard and they need to be paid fairly for their time. Traditionally, of course, there would have been a wool check, which probably would have covered the cost of shearing and some. We're in the sorry position now that it's not going to even go a significant part of the way to covering the costs of shearing. So that's the upsides, that's the downsides. What might you consider if you're thinking about this and you want to get it right? First of all, as ever, talk to your vet. They are the person best suited to giving you guidelines because they know your flock and your situation. Thinking about general principles is really going to differ by system. So are they indoor lambing or outdoor lambing? Climatic conditions, do you live in a kind of mildish, coldish country like the UK or New Zealand? Do you live in a subtropical country like parts of Australia? Do you live in a place where winters are far more severe than the UK or New Zealand, say some parts of North America? Important factors are going to be timing, so we don't want it too close up to lambing. Otherwise, we're going to trigger a whole slew of negative metabolic things like twin lamb disease, milk fever. You know, it's just going to be a nightmare. It's too much stress to place on heavily pregnant sheep. Both the stress of shearing, but also the potential for cold stress afterwards when demands are highest on them. They're growing those lambs, they're developing their colostrum. We're also going to have to consider the feed available on farm, whether that's grown on farm or bought in. We're also going to have to consider the individual condition of sheep, so really you should be body condition scoring them and drafting off any that are too skinny, below a 3 out of 5, and not shearing them. And finally, of course, we should consider the shelter on farm. Are there smaller sheltered paddocks you can put these ewes in shortly after shearing, just in case a colder snap runs through? In terms of the shearers, of course, hopefully you've got someone good who does your summer shearing. I'm sure they would know this anyway, but they tend to use different type of gear for winter shearing. They use something called a cover comb, and that leaves a significant amount of the fleece on, so they're still left with some sort of woolly jacket when they're turned back out. And last but not least, once you've talked to your vet, you've come up with a plan, you've considered all of these things, you're going to have to be adaptable. Because of course, Mother Nature is an unpredictable minx. And just to wind up this video, of course, even if we decide it's a good idea, even if we have the most perfect plan in place, even if we're being adaptable, in the real world, the availability of contractors and the poor price of strong wool is probably going to make this a no-no for plenty of people. But I'm not going to make any assumptions. Of course, the elephant in the room is these shedding sheep or hair sheep, which I know will be total anathema to a lot of you, but I know there will be some of you sitting there thinking, why doesn't everyone just have them? On that controversial note, I'll end there. Don't forget to click subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you for the next one.